So growing up, I never realized that I had family members who lived in a so-called terrorist state. I never realized that when I had decided to study abroad in Havana, Cuba last fall, that I would be spending 4 months in a country labeled by the United States government as a state that sponsors terrorism. For me, studying abroad meant reconnecting with family that I hadn't seen in over 8 years. It meant learning to live the life that my grandparents had left 50 years before me, and to really journey the life I could have had my grandparents never left. Cuba's on the state-sponsored terrorist list for 2 reasons. First, for fomenting revolutions in Latin America and in the abstract. And secondly, for being a safe haven for members of the ELN and the FARC, which are Colombian rebel groups. Now, if this was the 1980s and 1982 when Cuba was first put on the list, this would be a completely reasonable foreign policy. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, I think it's safe to say that Cuba doesn't feel that it can export these revolutions anymore. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba went through a series of economic depressions known as the Special Period. After this period, its leaders have officially come out saying that it is no longer capable, nor does it desire to foment any sort of revolution beyond its borders. On the second charge, it's true that the ELN and the FARC are still in Cuba today, but their meaning for being there is a little bit misunderstood. The ELN and the FARC are actually now in Cuba today because they are part of a series of negotiations that Cuba is facilitating between these rebel groups and the Colombian state in order to make sure that they can reintegrate into Colombian civil society and to disarm them and to actually, ironically, prevent the kind of terrorist actions that Cuba is being charged for today. So actually studying abroad in Cuba and actually spending time with my family, I think provided me with a radically different understanding of what terrorism means and what Cuba actually is in reality. For me, I was continually impressed upon the fact that there's a sincere devotion to humanity in Cuba, to understanding the plight of your neighbors and to doing things communally. I would travel to my cousins' houses all the time, and every day I'd be surprised to find someone who I didn't know, a new familiar face. And this was someone who had literally just walked off the street, needed a glass of water, needed to use the restroom, or just needed a moment in the shade. We would travel on the buses in Cuba all the time, and in Cuba, buses are known as wawas, because when the engines first came in from China, they made the sound wawa, wawa. And so Cubans refer to the bus system as wawas. And so I distinctly remember the first time I was on one of these wawas, an elderly woman with a cane approached me, and she asked me if I could help her get off the bus. And I was taken aback by this for a second because I couldn't actually understand what she had meant by her request. But what she was asking me for was to literally carry her physically down the steps of the bus and help her get to the sidewalk below. And for me, this enormous amount of trust in complete strangers that you'll never see again is something that defines the Cuban spirit. There's a sense of real trust for people you don't know because it's the only way that you can survive. And so for me, experiencing what life is like every day in Cuba made me realize how unjust this policy is and what are the implications for my family and the people on the ground. So being on the terrorist list means that Cuba is subject to a series of penalties and tariffs whenever they have to do any sort of international transaction. So when Cuba tries to import its food and it needs to import 60% of its food just to feed its people, it's taxed. My cousin Diana, she's 13 and she has multiple sclerosis. And during the time that I was in Cuba, I was fortunate to actually be able to share in her bat mitzvah celebration, a coming of age ceremony in the Jewish faith. But every day my family struggles not only to wait online for bread, to use their ration cards for minimal amounts of food, but they have to wait and worry to see if Cuba's budget will have enough to allocate medicine for her. And that's because of this policy. So to me, it's been incredibly unjust and something that I think we don't talk about enough. It's a part of our foreign policy that many Americans don't understand, but has real implications for both myself and my family and the way that we operate. So in light of the next presidential election and what just happened earlier this week, I think Barack Obama has an unprecedented opportunity to really change the way that we evaluate the system, to really think about the way that we treat our global community, and I think offers a new pathway, a new journey, or road not taken for us to reevaluate our foreign policy. Thank you.